Morning, Trainiacs. Just setting up a little setup for Instagram, a little before and after, because on the bike here, I just recently made some changes for, let me show you. The crank set. I changed the crank set on the Ventum to 165 length crank arms as opposed to 172.5, the standard that it came with and that a lot of tri bikes have historically come with. But a lot of people are going to these shorter crank lengths, myself included, because this is a really easy way to end up opening up your hips so that you're fresher for the run and more aerodynamic on the bike. At the same bike effort levels, you're gonna go faster on the bike and the run. I'm gonna show you the difference. It's good, and it's good. So, all right, Trainiacs, we are talking crank length. Now, crank length is the length from the center of your bottom bracket to the center of the pedal. Now, why a lot of people are going to a shorter crank length, where a lot of triathlon bikes and bikes in general have been getting shipped out historically with a 172.5 mil crank length to a 165, a 160, a 155 crank length, is because it ends up opening up the hips. It takes a little bit of pressure off the lower back. It allows athletes to raise up their saddle height and get lower. And when I put out that video that I shot this morning on Instagram just today, it caused some of the most comments of any post I've ever done, because people have a lot of opinions, both good and bad, about crank length. So let's talk about it. So let's talk function. What happens when you change your crank length from shorter to longer or longer to shorter? Well, there's one study that I found called The Effect of Crank Length on Joint-Specific Power During Maximal Cycling. This was done in 2011, and what it said essentially was that crank length does not play a role in power. So whether you do a shorter crank length or a longer crank length, you're going to be able to produce the same power. Great, we've got options, and it's not going to affect our performance. Another study done in 2017 called Acute Effects of Small Changes in Crank Length on Gross Efficiency and Pedaling Technique During Submaximal Cycling, essentially looking at, does crank length affect how efficient we are? And what this found is that crank length doesn't really change much with regards to efficiency, so it's not like we have to work any harder or easier depending on how our crank length goes, but there's more torque placed on our joints with a longer crank length. So the bottom line is that what we know is that shorter, longer crank lengths, as far as functionally what we put out with power and how it really affects our heart rate and the amount of calories that we're burning, it's not really going to have a big issue. Whether we go shorter or longer doesn't matter from that standpoint. That's good. I want to show you why going to a shorter crank length has some benefits, because if it's not going to affect our heart rate, drive it up, and it's not going to affect our power, drive it down, and we can perform the same with just our data, I want to show you how you can actually get more aerodynamic on the bike, going faster at the same power, and be fresher for the run, going faster on the run with the same bike effort. You don't have to dial it back. So on the bottom here, we have my bike position directly from the right at half Ironman Puerto Rico. On the top, we have the position from this morning. On the bottom is 172.5 cranks, longer cranks, these cranks. On the top is the 165 crank lengths. And it's a very, very small change, but essentially what happens is because the crank length is longer, the distance that your leg has to travel up ends up being greater with a longer crank length, which then ends up narrowing up the angle between your body and your legs. So you end up basically crunching a little bit more than with these shorter crank lengths, because with the shorter crank lengths, your leg doesn't have to travel up so high. Your knee doesn't have to travel up so high. So that angle ends up being a little bit wider. So we see at the bottom, angle is about 41. At the top, it's about 43. And that more open position, it ends up tiring out your legs more evenly on your quads and your hamstrings, so you're less likely to have cramps when you get onto the run. The next reason you'd want to shorten your crank lengths is so that you can get more aerodynamic. And how that happens is because your crank lengths are shorter, you end up having to raise your saddle height the distance of the shortened crank lengths. So in this case, I had to raise my saddle height 7.5 millimeters so that my foot can pass at the bottom of the pedal stroke with the same bend. But then what that results in is if the pads for your elbows are in the same position with a saddle height that's higher, I'm going to end up being shallower that way as opposed to angled up that way a little bit more. And that's going to end up tucking in behind my head a little bit better. So what you can see is that basically just the little tuft of hair at the back of my head is sticking up over my body there, whereas here it's basically everything over top of my ears. So you've ended up tucking your body in a little bit better into that channel that's created by your torso, and at the same time opened up your hips. So you're more aero and going to be fresher for the run. It's a good deal. Now, is this something that every single triathlete needs to do? If you've just bought your first road bike, your first tri bike, and you're like, oh, well, now Taren says that I have to change my crank lengths. Not really. It can be a pretty pricey upgrade. Could be anywhere from $200 to $800-900 depending on your group set. In addition to that, this isn't really something that you want to do yourself. I had to take my bike into the shop because there are special tools to take apart a crank set, and I dropped it off, had to pay for it, come back, and it's not an easy change. So we're talking hundreds of dollars to make this change. Now, if you are a more established triathlete and you're looking to buy speed and you have gone through purchasing wheels, you've gone through a bike fit, you already have an upgraded aero helmet, and you're looking for every single area that you can get more aerodynamic and buy as many additional watts and get yourself aerodynamic and fresh for the bike, this is a good place to do it, because 85% of the drag that is created with us going through the air is from our body. So we have to make our body position as narrow and as low as possible while still being comfortable. And this is one of the only ways to do that. Because a lot of the other ways where we're just getting more aero involves scrunching ourselves, getting lower, being more flexible. In this case, it requires actually less flexibility to be more aero. So if you're looking for those marginal gains and you don't mind spending a little bit of dough, look at changing your crank length. From all of the comments that we got on Instagram, somebody said it best when he said, if you go 165, you never go back. Check it out, Trainiacs. There you go. Thanks to Shimano for letting me replace this. Later.